I'm about to give you every single gardening tip I can think of because you're way too busy to be watching like 10 gardening videos to get the info that you want. And I'm going to be giving you guys some lazy gardener tips as well because we're busy. We do not have time to be spending hours and hours in the garden as much as we might want to. I am a busy mom of 4 boys, 6 and under. I homeschool. I do most of the homestead chores here at our house. So I don't have a lot of time. I feel pretty qualified to talk to you guys about how to actually get a decent harvest with not a lot of work. So let's talk about it. First things first, you do not need raised beds. Somebody's got to say it. Somebody's got to tell you, you do not need to spend a lot of money to get started gardening. Now, we have our garden in IBC totes. They're cut in half. This was what was already here when we bought our property. And I think that raised beds, container gardening, things like that are great if you have a property that floods right where you want to put your garden, things like that. This can be a fantastic option. But if it doesn't flood, if there is no reason to be using raised beds or containers, unless you want to, but if there's no reason for it, you don't need to do it. You can garden right in the ground. So if you think that you need to spend a lot of money or that you need to wait until you have the perfect raised bed or the perfect container to get gardening, you don't. Now, there are great reasons for raised beds. Things like maybe it's hard for you to get all the way down on the ground. You want it to help with weed pressure. You just like the look of it. These are all valid, but you don't have to have raised beds to get started with gardening. One of the number one time savers when it comes to gardening is to not be planting seeds that you need to start. So things like tomatoes and peppers, these are things that you're often going to start in smaller pots and then transplant them into your garden later. I did this for years, and while it can save you some money because starts can be expensive, also time is money, and it does take time to be planting those seeds, watering them, taking care of them for the 4, 6, 8 weeks that they need before you can plant them in your garden. So honestly, if you want to be growing things that you need starts for, consider buying them if you are very busy. Now, if you want to grow your own starts, you do want to do that. Get them in a seed starting pot that's going to be large enough that you can just grow them in that until it's time to transplant. I'll put a link for one of my favorite pots, the ones that I used to use when we were starting our own seeds. I'll put a link to that in the description. But if you are going to start your own seeds, put them in a larger container so you're not up-potting them before transplanting. This will save you a lot of time. My absolute number one tip for having a thriving garden without spending a ton of time in your garden is to actually be planting things that want to grow in your area. I know that this is so hard. It really is, because you see some people that are able to just grow everything under the sun, and it just seems to work for them. But honestly, if you want to have a good time gardening, you need to find what grows well in your area. And bonus points if this plant will thrive on some neglect, especially if you're very busy. After about 4 years of gardening, there are just some things that do not grow well where I live and that also just don't handle being neglected so that I can care for my actual children and not just my plant babies. So planting things that meet those 2 criteria are going to make it so much easier for you. Now, when it comes to figuring out what grows well in your area, you just can do a quick Google search and really find that out. Also, following people on social media or reading books about gardening in your area, that will help a ton for knowing what will grow well for you. Also, trial and error. But I would say when it comes to gardening, you want to start small. You don't want to like shoot for the moon and get super overwhelmed. So start with a couple things that are looking like they're going to grow well in your area and really double down on those. Because if you're trying to start a garden to bring food into the house, to cut your grocery bill, you don't necessarily need to grow every single thing that they have at the grocery store. You need to grow things that work well for you and things that your family will actually eat. Grow more of those things and you will find your grocery bill cut down. When I talk about things thriving on neglect, I don't mean that I'm just not paying any attention to my garden whatsoever. But if a plant is needing constant sprayings, if it's needing constant pruning, this for me as a busy mom is not the best option. So I might still plant those things, but I'm going to plant fewer of those and more of the things that do really well for me with not a lot of work. Another great time saver is something that I call interval gardening. I'm sure I'm not the only one to talk about this, but you do not need to spend hours and hours in your garden. If you have an extra 15 minutes in your day before you go outside, think about what it is that you want to do in that 15 minutes. gather your supplies, get out there, set a timer. You will be so surprised in what you can do in that 15 minutes. And honestly, these small things add up to big things at the end of the season. So if you can truly get 15 minutes, 15, 30 minutes in your garden, maybe 3 to 4 times a week, that is a good amount of time at the end of the week, especially if you had a plan before you walked out the door to go into your garden, so you knew exactly what you were going to be doing when you went out there and you were able to be efficient. So you do not need to spend a ton of time in your garden. You just need to be intentional about the time you do have. Let's talk about the tools that you need to garden. It is so much easier and honestly better, in my opinion, to keep this simple. Some of the things that are must-haves in my garden are a good pair of gardening gloves. I love these. They come in a 3-pack. They're easy to wash. They're very inexpensive in case you misplace them in the garden like I always do, but I really love having a good pair of gloves when it comes to weeding. Also, a pitchfork. I know this is so random, but a pitchfork is the best item for picking up things like wood chips, mulch, and adding them into your garden if that's something that you're going to do. I also love having a small hoe. I think this is called a hula hoe. This is great for if you want to weed an area really quickly, especially if you have raised beds or something like that. If you have an in-ground garden, you might want to go with a longer version of this, but having something that can quickly weed an area or quickly aerate an area is really nice. Now, we don't want to be planting things where you're going to need to spray a ton of stuff all the time, but having a sprayer where you can apply some treatments to your plants is very helpful. Some other miscellaneous things that I love to have are things like gardening Velcro. You can also use some twine for this. That works really well. Just something that you can tie your plants up to a trellis or a stake or something like that. Speaking of stakes, I do like to keep on hand some of these green stakes. I've got a ton of them in my garden and they come in handy all the time for when I need to support a plant. Lastly, I really like cattle panel trellises. I know that they're like all the rage, they're very trendy, but we have gotten a ton of use out of ours. And these are much sturdier and better than any garden trellis you might find, in my opinion. So we really, really like having these. Let's talk about watering. What irrigation system should you use? Should you use drip? Should you use sprinklers? And honestly, when you're first starting out, you should definitely just water by hand at first to see what you like, how much water your plants need. And this is truly the best medicine for your plants. You can fix a lot of problems. You can catch a lot of issues by spending that time with your plants every single day to water them by hand. It is so much easier to see pest issues, to see nutrient deficiencies if you're standing there staring at your plants when you water them. Give it some time. Try this for a while. I know it can be a lot to water your garden by hand depending on how large it is. We're in the deep south and I did this for about, I think 1.5, maybe 2.5 years. And sometimes this was watering twice a day for 30 minutes a day when we hit summer. So I know that it's hard and you don't have to do this if you don't want to, but that truly is my best advice. Water by hand for a while, and then you can really know what you like, what system would work for you, and if you even want to do an irrigation system. Honestly, sometimes it can be a little costly and you may choose that it's not right for you. But in the beginning, don't complicate it, just water your plants by hand. I said this earlier, but it is really important to find a gardener in your area, to find a couple of them. I'm not saying you have to find them in person, but to look online and find some people that are gardening in the same area as you, or to read a book about gardening in your area. I made this mistake when I first started gardening. I just found a bunch of people that were really popular online that were gardening and was getting a lot of advice from them. And one of the things that I heard was that you should deep water. So if you watered your plants really deeply, so you focused on one plant and you watered it for a minute or something, then you wouldn't need to water again except for maybe one other time that week. But that does not work for me. Like I said, we're in the deep south. It is hot here in the summer. My plants were so thirsty. It is so hot. The UV level here is insane. And so deep watering is something that might have worked in another climate, but definitely does not work in my climate. So you will save yourself a lot of time and effort if you take most of your advice from people that are gardening in around the same area as you. So what kind of amendments should you add to your garden? Now, the first thing I'm going to say is that you need to focus on feeding the soil and not the plant. I know that this sounds very oversimplified, but it is true. If you can focus on adding organic material to your garden, things like compost, manure, wood chips, those things are going to do a great job at feeding the soil. You're going to have a living, active soil that can better feed your plants. Now, there are a couple amendments that you probably have right in your house that I think are fantastic for the garden. The first being coffee and coffee filters, used coffee. I love to add this to my garden beds. Now, this is especially great if a plant likes something acidic, but truly there's not a ton of acidity left after you brew that coffee. So I add this basically to all of my beds. I just bring my coffee filters out a couple times a week and throw them right in a bed. No big deal. And it's really great. It's just another thing that I can add. You can also make your own compost. You can make your own compost tea out of weeds that you're already taking out of your garden. You can get wood chips from places like Chip Drop. If you have any livestock, their composted manure. If you have rabbits or something where their manure is cold, you can add that straight on there. And then my favorite amendment, my favorite fertilizer to add, and I need you guys to like not freak out. Are you sitting down? Are you sitting down? My favorite thing to add to the garden as far as fertilizer, if I really need a quick pick-me-up for my plants, is diluted urine. I know. This sounds very strange. I know. But it works. It really does work. So I'm just going to tell you what we do. You can do what you want to do. If you look at the back of the fertilizers at your store, you're going to see why diluted urine would be similar in the nutrient profile and why I think that you shouldn't always be throwing away this free resource. So what do? We take about 24 to 32 ounces of urine. We are going to put that in about a 2-gallon watering can, fill the rest up with water. You definitely want to dilute this. And this is something that's going to go on the base of plants, or you could put this on the top as a foliar feed of things that haven't fruited yet. This is definitely not something that you're putting on your fruits or vegetables, okay? This is obvious. And you're not going to be putting this on leafy greens that you're going to eat as is. But at the base of a plant, it works incredibly well. I know that this sounds gross, but if you have a plant that is about to die, I have seen this revive plants time and time again, and it is a free resource. It's a zero waste resource that truly does work if you want to use it. Nobody's making you do it, but if it's something you want to try, I'm just saying it does work. Now, I said that I don't like to spray a bunch of stuff in my garden. So what do you do if you see pests and things like that? And I think that you should just stop, assess, and take a second to figure out your plan. You do not need to come in and every single time you see a pest to spray something. Oftentimes, you just need a little bit of time for the beneficial insects to come in and get the bad insects. If you are wanting to spray something, I really like BT, I like spinosad. I do keep those on hand because as we move into the summer here, the pests are crazy where I live, and things like caterpillars, they just go wild. And so sometimes I do need to get on a weekly regimen of something like BT or, on and off with BT and spinosad. So I'm not saying to not have anything on hand or to not do anything if you see a pest, but sometimes you need to literally be picking off the bugs, flicking bugs into a dish soap mixture. Sometimes that is just what you need to do with organic gardening. But the first thing to do if you see a pest or you see a nutrient problem is not to freak out, not to just run inside, figure out what you can quickly treat it with and spray it on there. Give it a second. Give it a little bit of time, see what happens, and formulate a plan. Oftentimes the garden just needs a little bit of time to right itself. So don't freak out, don't spray things right away, just take a second. It's really not that big of a deal. If you want to look like an absolute all-star gardener, just overplant. Then when things don't germinate, when they get killed by pests, when your soil wasn't nutrient rich enough and they just died off, you will still have some plants that make it and you will look amazing and you will have a great harvest at the end of the day. Just overplant like crazy. That way, when these things happen, as they will, when wind breaks your tomato branch that was just filled with tomatoes, you will have more plants and it's not as big of a deal. Things happen year to year. Everything is different. But if you plant more than you think you'll need, usually you're going to end up with a really great harvest. Another great thing is to be mixing in flowers with your vegetables when you can. 2 flowers that I think are just absolutely great for the beginner gardener or great if you don't have a lot of time are Cosmos and Zinnia. Now these 2 are pretty quick to reseed, so if you don't want them in that area next time, you're going to want to pick those as they come up next season. If you do want them to reseed, that's fantastic. They do a great job of that. But these are super easy for you to grow. They require very little maintenance or anything, especially Cosmos. They're my absolute favorite. And they make a large, beautiful statement in the garden, and the pollinators absolutely love them. So I definitely think you should mix those in. It's great for the bees, it's great for your garden, and you're going to get a better garden harvest usually if you're planting in those flowers as well to encourage the pollinators. Now, I said that cosmos and zinnia are really great. They're some of my favorite flowers to grow, but what about vegetables? My all-time favorite vegetable to grow, the easiest for me and probably a very easy one wherever you are beans, green beans. Bush beans and pole beans alike, they're fantastic. They grow easily. They really don't need much, and I absolutely love growing them. Cucumbers can be very easy to grow as well. If you are in the South like I am, you really need to give those guys water. I thought that I could not grow cucumbers for the life of me, but it turns out they just needed way more water, which makes sense when you think about what they're mainly made up of. Tomatoes are another one that's also pretty easy to grow, but they do require a little bit of pruning, a little bit of maintenance. So if you don't have time for that, they may not be something that you want to grow a ton of. One of the things that's incredibly easy for us here to grow are sweet potatoes. And if you're a little more northern, regular potatoes might be easy for you as well. I really encourage you to give potatoes a try, whether it is regular or sweet potatoes. They're a very set it and forget it type of vegetable and so fun to dig up. One of the things I really want to touch on is priority when it comes to going into your garden, especially when you don't have a lot of time. When you're going into the garden, I really think that there are some things that are not that big of a deal to handle and other things that you should be doing every single day or as many times a week as you can. And so when I go into my garden, the first thing, the most important thing to get done is to make sure that I'm planting seeds or I'm transplanting plants into my garden. In order to get a harvest, you have to have things sprouting, you have to have things growing. So I aim to try to plant a couple seeds every day or get a plant in the garden every day during that planting season. And then after I'm able to do that, maintaining the plants that I already have, keeping them healthy, pruning them, fertilizing them if they need it. This is my next priority. And absolutely last on my list is going to be things like weeding. Now, of course, you don't want weeds to completely overtake your garden. That will compete with your plants for nutrients. It's not great. It'll crowd them out. But a couple weeds here and there are not something to freak out about, and they're not something to rush to take care of. You can have a fantastic garden with some weeds in your garden beds, but you can't have a fantastic garden if you're not planting seeds and maintaining and keeping the plants that you already have healthy. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, would you like, subscribe, leave me a comment, and let me know what you're growing in your garden this year. And if you did like this video, I really think that you would like this one. It's all on my super easy method for starting seeds. Now, I know I'm favoring direct sowing right now, but if you want to learn the skill of starting your own seeds, you want to save some money that way, I think this video would be super helpful for you. I'm really glad that you were here. I hope that you're having a great day, and I will see you guys in the next video.